There's a moment, and I think everyone who's been in a real crisis knows exactly what I'm talking about, where time just stops. Not slows down, stops. Like the universe takes a breath and holds it. And in that frozen half-second, everything you think you know about yourself gets tested. Every story you've told about who you are, what you do, how brave or how cowardly you really are, all of it gets put on the table. Darian Voss had one of those moments on Depot Station Kel 7. And what he did in it changed everything. Not just for him, not just for the woman he stepped in front of, for all of us. For what the rest of the galaxy thought humans were capable of. For what some of us honestly thought we were capable of. I was there, I saw it. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Part 1, the station at the edge of everywhere. Let me paint you a picture of Kel 7 first, because if you've never been to a deep transit depot, you won't understand the kind of place this was. Kel 7 wasn't beautiful. Nobody built it to be beautiful. It was a way station, a fuel and cargo junction floating in the crescent drift, which is this wide, mostly empty stretch of space between the hegemony's outer territories and what everyone just called the frontier. No man's land, basically, or no species' land, the kind of place where the rules get a little loose. The station itself was a mess of welded corridors, pressurized docking rings, and retrofit life support that hummed and rattled if you pressed your hand against the walls. The original structure had been an ore processing platform. You could still smell it, that faint mineral burn underneath everything, like rust that had been cooked into the metal itself. Layers of expansion had been added over decades by whoever owned the lease at the time, so the architecture made no sense. You'd walk down a perfectly modern corridor with clean polymer walls and recessed lighting, and then suddenly you'd have to duck under a support strut that had no business being at head height, and the floor would change material 3 times in 10 meters. The population was maybe 4,000 permanent residents, but the transit population on any given shift could triple that. Every species with business between the core systems and the frontier came through Kel 7 at some point. Merchants, diplomats, refugees, soldiers, bounty contractors, medics attached to NGO vessels, academic researchers, and the kind of people who didn't explain their business, and you learned not to ask. Humans had been working Kel 7 for about 40 years by the time this happened. We weren't a majority, not even close. Maybe 600 of us on the permanent roster, working everything from cargo handling to life support maintenance to the commissary kitchens. The hegemony tolerated our presence the way you tolerate a slightly annoying neighbor, not warmly, but not actively trying to get rid of us either. We were useful. We worked cheap by galactic standards. We had manual dexterity that some of the more limb-challenged species couldn't match. And we had this stubborn tendency to fix things that weren't supposed to be fixable. I worked in logistics coordination. My job was basically making sure cargo manifests matched what was actually in the containers, which sounds boring because it was boring, except when it wasn't, and on Kel 7, it wasn't boring more often than you'd expect. Darian Voss worked dock security. I want to be clear about what that meant. Dock security on Kel 7 was not a prestigious position. It wasn't military, it wasn't hegemony enforcement, it wasn't anything that anyone with better options would choose. You worked for the station's private management consortium, which had the budget of a mid-tier catering company and the organizational coherence of a committee that disagreed about everything. Your equipment was second-hand. Your armor was rated for civilian crowd management. Your sidearm was a pulse deterrent, the kind of thing that would knock a human-sized being down for a few minutes, but wouldn't do anything meaningful against anything heavily armored or determined. Dock security's actual job was mostly stand in the right places, look official, de-escalate small arguments before they became medium arguments, check manifests, and call for hegemony enforcement when things got above your pay grade. Darian had been doing it for 3 years. He was 26. Medium height, the kind of build that came from actually working rather than training, solid through the shoulders, nothing flashy. He had this habit of rolling his left shoulder when he was tense, like he was trying to work out a knot. I noticed that about him because I'd eaten lunch near him maybe twice a week for 2 years, and some people you just notice things about without meaning to. He wasn't the type you'd pick out of a lineup as a hero. That's kind of the whole point. The day it happened, Station Day 1847, by the Kel 7 internal calendar. which translates to early spring if you're timing it against Earth's northern hemisphere. Not that that meant anything on a station. Started the way most days on Kel 7 started. Loud. The transit corridors ran 22 hours out of every 26-hour station cycle, and the main concourse, a wide, vaulted space on level 3 that connected the docking rings to the commercial district and the transit lounges, was always busy. The ceiling of the concourse was about 8 meters up, with these old industrial lighting strips that flickered slightly at one end where someone had patched a power relay badly and never properly fixed it. There were vendors along both walls, food stalls, equipment suppliers, a Manati currency exchange, 2 competing medical supply kiosks that were locked in a permanent Cold War over adjacent territory. The sounds were, layered isn't a strong enough word. Every species has different vocal frequencies, different patterns of communication, and in a busy transit concourse, all of it hit you at once. There was the low, rhythmic clicking of Drevari traders somewhere to the left, the sharp, sibilant exchanges of a group of Krothe porters moving a cargo float down the center lane, the almost musical hum of the concourse's ventilation system, and underneath all of it, the constant mechanical heartbeat of the station itself, the pressure cycling, the docking ring rotations, the life support running without pause. I was cutting through the concourse at the end of my shift. My data slate was under my arm. I had a headache from 3 hours of reconciling a container manifest that had been misfiled in 2 different systems, and I was thinking about nothing except getting to the commissary before the good food ran out. That's when I saw her. You have to understand, I'd seen Vale before. Everyone who worked on Kel 7 long enough had seen Vale. But seeing Vale was not a comfortable experience. The Vale Compact was one of the 3 dominant powers in this region of the galaxy, alongside the Hegemony and the Rathkind Dominion. They were, and I say this with complete respect and also genuine fear, the most physically capable warrior species most of us had ever heard of. They were tall, averaging somewhere between 2 and 2.5 meters, depending on subspecies, with this layered physiological structure that combined dense musculature with a secondary skeletal reinforcement system. They had 4 arms, 2 primary, longer ones with 5-fingered hands, and 2 shorter secondary arms positioned lower on the torso. And they could use all 4 simultaneously with full coordination, which was an ability that had translated into a fighting style that even Hegemony tactical analysts described as severely not to be engaged without overwhelming advantage. Their skin, if you could call it that, it was more of a biomechanical integument, had this dark iridescent quality, shifting between deep blue-black and something that caught light like polished obsidian. Their faces were broad and angular, with wide-set eyes that had horizontal pupils, and they communicated through a combination of sound and these subtle micro-expressions that their own species could read from significant distances. Vale soldiers were not assigned to Kel 7. They weren't part of the station's security, they weren't regular merchants, they weren't diplomatic staff. When a Vale came through Kel 7, it was either because their ship needed repairs, or because they were in transit between something that was their business and not yours. The Vale warrior standing in the center of the concourse was not in transit. She had stopped, and she was alone, which was wrong because Vale didn't travel alone in foreign territory. It was a cultural thing, not cowardice, the opposite. Traveling alone was considered a statement of intention, and the statement it usually made was not a friendly one. She stood about 2.3 meters tall. Her armor, and I know armor when I see it, even alien armor, was not the standard travel-grade composite most species wore for basic protection. It was full Vale combat plate, the layered ceramic polymer configuration with the distinctive pauldron extensions that served as both protection and a marking system for rank. It was dark, almost black, with this subtle geometric pattern worked into the surface that I later learned was an honor notation, a record of engagements, carved in shorthand into the material itself. She was standing still, but still in the way a predator stands still, not at rest, but containing herself. And her secondary arms were crossed over her torso, in a configuration that the translation briefing I'd sat through 18 months ago had described as protective hostile, meaning she felt threatened, and was deciding whether to act on that feeling. I stopped walking. About half the concourse stopped with me. The group facing her had not stopped. There were 6 of them. They were Croth, stocky, 4-legged, with a manipulator cluster where a biped would have shoulders. Crothi were common on Kel 7. They worked cargo, they ran freight contracts, and they had a complicated cultural relationship with the Vale that went back about 300 years to a territorial conflict that had never been fully resolved. There were Crothi who were perfectly civil about it. And then there were Crothi like these 6. They were dock workers from the look of them, heavy work vests, equipment harnesses, the kind of build that came from hauling freight containers in partial gravity. They were arranged in a rough arc, not quite a semicircle, not quite threatening, but close enough that it read as deliberate crowding rather than accidental proximity. I could hear them from where I was, which was about 15 meters back. Crothi vocalizations are in a frequency range that human ears pick up clearly, and the station's translation layer, the ambient system built into the concourse's environmental systems, the kind of passive tech that processed common languages automatically, was rendering them in real time on a low murmur. They were not saying anything overtly violent. That was the thing. They were saying things that translated as questions about her travel permits, questions about whether she had authorization to be in this section of the concourse unescorted, questions about her cargo declarations, all perfectly reasonable questions to ask of a traveler on a regulated transit station. But the tone, even through translation, was wrong. The tone was the thing that made the back of your neck tighten. It was the specific kind of politely framed aggression that is designed to be plausibly deniable but communicates something completely unambiguous to everyone in the room. You don't belong here. We can make this difficult for you. What are you going to do about it? The Veil warrior wasn't moving. She was responding to the questions, short, controlled answers, her primary hands visible and open, the station's translation layer catching fragments of her replies. But her secondary arms hadn't uncrossed, and her eyes were tracking all 6 of them in a pattern that I recognized from nothing except instinct as the way you track threats when you're calculating angles. She was a warrior. She could probably have ended all 6 of them in under 30 seconds. She wasn't doing that, and I think that was the thing that made it so awful to watch. She was containing herself. She was choosing, consciously, not to escalate, because she knew she had to know that if she engaged, even if she was in the right, the political fallout would be significant. A Veil warrior killing Crothi nationals on a neutral transit station over what was technically a harassment incident. That was an incident. That was paperwork that went all the way up to compact diplomatic channels. So she stood there, choosing restraint, and the 6 of them were using that restraint against her. The concourse had cleared a significant radius around them, everyone watching, nobody moving. I was one of the nobody movings. I'm not proud of that, but I want to be honest about it because this story isn't about me being brave. It's about Darian. He came from the East Corridor, the one that connected to docking ring 4, where he'd been doing a standard transit check. He was on his way back to the security station, off shift in about 40 minutes, and he walked into the concourse and read the situation in about 3 seconds flat. I watched him stop, watched him assess. He was carrying a pulse deterrent on his hip, standard issue, insufficient. He had a comm unit clipped to his vest, standard issue, also insufficient, because by the time any backup he called arrived, this would be over one way or another. He was wearing Doc's security armor that would not stop anything a Veil warrior could do to him if she decided he was a threat, and certainly would not stop anything the 6 Crothi could do to him if they decided the same. He had no tactical advantage, no meaningful reinforcement, no authority that meant anything in a confrontation involving species that answered to compact governments, not station management. He walked toward them anyway. And here's the thing, he didn't run. He didn't come in hot. He walked at a measured pace, the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and a job to do, and he kept his hands visible and his posture non-aggressive, and he got to within about 4 meters of the whole situation before any of them really clocked him. The lead Crothi turned. He was a big one, freight worker build, probably had 30 kilograms on Darian in pure mass, and the Crothi weight distribution between those 4 legs made them harder to move than they looked. He looked at Darian. Darian looked back. "Hey," Darian said. Just that, hey. Like he'd run into someone he knew at a market. I'm going to pause here and describe the Veil warrior more carefully because she matters. Not just as the person Darian stepped in front of, but as who she was. And I didn't know who she was at the time, none of us did, but I've since learned enough to fill in the picture. Her name, in Vale phonology, was something that translated roughly to Kethara of the 3rd Vanguard, but she went by Keth among the few non-Vale she'd interacted with who'd earned any familiarity. She was 31 years old in the Vale age counting system, which mapped to about 42 in human terms because Vale matured more slowly in their early decades. She held the rank of Silence Commander in the 3rd Vanguard, one of 7 elite combat formations in the Vale military hierarchy. The rank didn't translate perfectly to anything in human military tradition, but the closest approximation was something between a Special Forces Major and a unit commander, with additional authority that came from the Vale honor notation system carved into her armor. She had participated in 34 documented engagements. She had led 17 of them. The Vale 3rd Vanguard had a win record that the hegemony military intelligence analysts described in a memo I eventually obtained a copy of as statistically disturbing. She was, by any reasonable metric, one of the most dangerous individuals in this sector of the galaxy. She was also standing in a transit concourse being slowly crowded by 6 freight workers who thought they could humiliate her with paperwork questions. And she was letting them, because she understood the political geometry of the situation and was choosing the longer game. Until Darian walked over. "Hey," Darian said again, and this time he directed it at the lead Crothi. The Crothi's manipulator cluster shifted, the species equivalent of turning to face someone, combined with a subtle bristling that their body language conveyed when they felt challenged. The translation layer caught his response. "Station security. Good. This individual has no verified transit authorization in this section." "I've got her," Darian said. "Silence." The Crothi stared at him. "You?" "She's with me," Darian said. "My responsibility, my section. I'll handle the authorization check." He paused, and then, and this is the part I've replayed in my head more times than I can count, he turned to the 6 of them as a group and said, with absolute calm, "You all need to move along now." The words are not impressive on a page. You all need to move along now? It's not a speech. It's not a declaration. It's the kind of thing a low-level station employee says when he wants people to stop blocking a corridor. But the way he said it the way someone says something they have already decided is true. Not a request. Not even really a command. More like a statement about what was about to happen, delivered in advance to give everyone a chance to catch up. The lead Crothi didn't move immediately. He held for a moment, held the way things hold when they're deciding between 2 options, and then something shifted in his posture. I think it was the certainty. Because here's the thing about that kind of politely framed aggression. It depends on the target being alone. It depends on the situation being asymmetric, on everyone understanding that the power balance is one-sided. When someone steps into that situation and acts like the balance has changed, not aggressively, not with any obvious power behind them, just with the absolute confidence that it has changed, the whole thing wobbles. The Crothi muttered something the translation layer caught as a low-priority dismissal, the equivalent of whatever, not worth it, and began to move. The others followed. They drifted back toward the cargo corridor they'd come from, taking their time about it, maintaining the pretense of their own choosing, but moving. They moved. Darian watched them go. Then he turned to the Vale warrior. "This is the part where I wish I could tell you he said something profound. Something that would look good cut into a memorial plaque somewhere. He didn't." He looked up at her. She had a good 30 centimeters on him, maybe more, and he said, "You okay?" And she looked at him. The way she looked at him. I was 15 meters away, and I felt it. It was not a warm look. It was not a grateful look, not yet, not the way gratitude usually looks. It was the look of someone who has been through enough to not accept things at face value, who has learned that apparent kindness often has a mechanism underneath it, who is trying to figure out what this small, unarmed, unranked human being actually is. She said in the Vale language, something that the translation layer rendered as, "You are dock security." "Yeah," Darian said. "Your authority here is limited." "Very," he agreed. "You had no tactical advantage in that engagement." "Nope." She was quiet for a moment. Her secondary arms uncrossed slowly, the first time they'd moved since I'd been watching. It was a small thing, but it meant something. "Why did you intervene?" Darian shrugged. Actually shrugged, the rolling shoulder movement, the casual lift and settle. "Because it needed doing," he said, "and I was there. I went to the commissary. I got my food. I sat down at a table in the corner and I couldn't tell you what I ate because my brain was elsewhere entirely. Because it needed doing, and I was there." I've thought about that answer a lot in the years since. The simplicity of it, the absence of any calculation in it. I think looking back, that's what she heard too. Not a hero's announcement, not a claim on gratitude or status or reciprocity, just a reason that was complete in itself. Something needed doing. He was there, so he did it. It's such a human thing to say. I'm not sure she'd ever heard anything quite like it. Part 2, the HOURS after. Kel 7 had a security debrief process for any concourse incident that involved species from compact governments. It was mostly bureaucratic theater. The station management needed documentation to cover itself against diplomatic complaints. But it meant that Darian spent the next 2 hours in a small conference room off the main security station, filing a report. I know what happened in those 2 hours not because I was there, but because Darian told me about it later, and because the security station's incident log is on record. The Veil warrior, Kethara, though he didn't know her name yet, asked to be present for the debrief. This was unusual. Witnesses to incidents usually just gave a statement and left. But she stayed, seated across the table from Darian and the duty supervisor, and she answered every question put to her with precise, measured responses, and she watched Darian the entire time. The duty supervisor, a woman named Priya Osman who'd been running security admin on Kel 7 for 11 years and had seen everything, later told me that she'd felt like she was sitting in a room with 2 separate categories of being. Darian filling out forms. The Veil warrior watching him fill out forms with the focused attention of someone memorizing a map. At one point, the duty supervisor asked the standard question: had the subject suffered any physical harm during the incident? The translation layer rendered the Veil warrior's response as no. The dock officer's intervention prevented the necessity of a physical response on my part. Priya made a note. Then, because she was Priya and she'd been doing this long enough to say what she was thinking, she said, "Sounds like we got lucky." The Veil warrior looked at her. "You misunderstand the nature of the luck," she said. Priya said, "How so?" "The fortunate element was not the outcome for me. I was in no danger that concerned me. The fortunate element was that your officer's action prevented a political incident that would have created significant difficulties for this station's operating relationships." She paused. "He did not know that," she added. "He acted without knowing that. He acted because," and here the translation layer hit a slight gap, the way it sometimes did with Veil when they were reaching for a concept that didn't map cleanly, because it was the right shape of action for the moment. Priya looked at her, looked at Darian, who was staring at his form with the expression of a man who was pretending he wasn't listening very hard. "Yeah," Priya said, "that sounds like him." The debrief wrapped up. The Veil warrior left the security station. Darian finished his shift, handed his report to Priya, and went to the crew quarters section where he'd been renting a bunk for 3 years. He told me later he figured that was the end of it. He figured wrong. 3 days passed. On Kel 7, 3 days is a substantial chunk of time. The transit population turns over fast. Ships come in, refuel, move on. People you see in the commissary Monday you'll never see again by Thursday. The station has a quality of impermanence that you either find depressing or freeing depending on your disposition. The Veil warrior's ship, a compact but heavy-built vessel that the docking system had logged as a Veil military courier, which was itself unusual since military couriers didn't normally make transit stops at civilian depots, was still in the docking ring. I noticed because I logged transit stays as part of my manifest job. It wasn't my business why she was still there. It was just a data point. On the 3rd day, Darian found a small data chip at his security station post. It was sitting on the edge of his console when he came in for his shift. Just sitting there, no packaging, no note, the kind of chip that had to be physically touched to a reader. He told me he almost didn't read it. He almost put it in the processing bin for lost property. He did read it. The chip contained a single file, a short audio message in Vale with a translation text file alongside it. The translation said, "Doc Officer, I have not previously given consideration to the question of what would motivate a being of limited tactical capacity and no political obligation to insert himself between a Vale silence commander and a threatening group without calculation or request. I have given it consideration now. I have no framework for this behavior in any species I have encountered. I find the absence of a framework unsatisfying. I will be departing this station tomorrow. I will not return to this sector for at least 14 cycles, but I want you to know that your action was observed and registered. In Vale culture, an act of protection between strangers, freely given without calculation of return, carries a specific weight. We have a word for it. It does not translate well. The closest approximation your translation systems produce is shield debt. But this is inadequate because it implies obligation on my part, and what I feel is not obligation. It is something closer to recognition. You are a strange species. I mean this as the highest form of compliment I have available. Darien showed me the chip that evening in the commissary. He handed me the reader with the translation pulled up and waited while I read it. I read it twice. She's the third Vanguard, I said, because by that point I'd looked her up. I'd seen the armor marking and done the research, and I was genuinely unsettled by what I'd found. Darien, she's one of their silence commanders. Do you understand what that? She seemed stressed, he said. He was eating something that might have been soup. Standing there alone with those 6 guys crowding her, she seemed, I don't know, not scared, but like she was having to work at staying calm. She probably was, I said. Because if she'd put any of those Crothy on the floor, we'd have a diplomatic incident. Right, he said. He shrugged his left shoulder. So she needed someone to take that off her. I stared at him. You did it because she looked stressed, I said. Partially, he said. Also because it was my section and those guys were being jerks. I handed the reader back. He put it in his vest pocket. We sat there for a while. The third Vanguard, I said again, because my brain was still processing. I know, he said. The most feared combat unit in. I know, Ren. He used my nickname, which he almost never did. I know now. He didn't know then, when he walked over. When he said hey, when he told the Crothy to move along, when he asked her if she was okay. He had no idea who she was. He just saw someone having a rough time in his section. And he did something about it. Part 3, Kethera. I've been building to this part, and I want to take some time with it, because it's the part that most people get wrong when they retell this story. They focus on Darien, understandably. He's the one who stepped in, he's the one who ran the risk, he's the one the story is technically about. But if you only look at Darien, you miss half of what this was. Kethera of the 3rd Vanguard had arrived at Kel 7 under circumstances that were not public knowledge, and that I've only pieced together from sources I can't fully name, so take the edges of this part with appropriate uncertainty. But the core of it holds. She had been detached from her unit. Not punished, detached. There's a difference in Vale military culture. Punishment involved formal censure, a mark on the honor armor that was visible and read by anyone who knew the notation system. Detachment was different. It was used when a commander needed to be somewhere officially unofficial, present but not present, representing the compact without representing it, if you follow. The mission, if you could call it that, had something to do with a territorial boundary dispute in the Crescent Drift, one of about a dozen ongoing low-simmer conflicts that didn't rise to the level of open engagement, but never fully cooled either. The Vale wanted eyes on certain shipping routes. They wanted someone capable and senior enough to assess, but not so visibly present that it became a diplomatic statement. They sent Kethera alone. Now understand what that meant for her personally, separate from the political dimension. She was a silence commander. She was used to operating with her unit, 24 warriors she had trained with for years, people she knew the way you know your own hands. She was used to the weight of that trust, that context, that shared understanding of how they all moved together. Alone on a civilian transit station, with no backup, no unit authority, no one who knew her, she was as close to vulnerable as a Vale silence commander could get without actually being in danger. And then 6 Crothi freight workers decided she was a convenient target for whatever accumulated resentment they were carrying from a war that had ended before any of them were born. I've thought about what that moment must have felt like for her. Not the physical threat, she'd processed that quickly and accurately, determining that the risk of actual violence was low, but the risk of escalation was real. It was the other thing, the being alone and crowded in public thing, the being made to feel small thing. Because here's what people forget about the most feared warriors, they still feel it. They still feel the thing that feeling small does to you, they just can't show it. And sometimes having to not show it is worse than the thing itself. And then a human in second-hand security armor walked over and said, "Hey, I'll tell you something that Cathara told me directly years later, when we were on different terms and she was willing to talk about it." She said, "In 34 engagements I have had unit members shield me. This is normal in combat. You cover each other, you trade off exposure, it is tactical. I have had commanders assign protection details to me when I was carrying sensitive intelligence. This is also tactical. I understand tactical shielding." She paused. She had this habit of pausing when she was getting to something that cost her something to say. "I had not experienced," she said, "the other kind. The kind where someone acts without unit bond, without order, without tactical logic. Where a being simply decides that what is happening in front of them is wrong and moves to correct it. I had read about this in documentation of other species. I had not observed it. I had not felt it directed at me." Another pause. "It is a more significant thing than I had understood from documentation," she said. She left Kel 7 the next day, as she'd said in the message. Her ship pulled away from docking ring 2 at the start of the 3rd operational cycle, and the transit log recorded it, and life on the station continued. Darian went back to his shifts. He walked the corridors. He checked manifests and de-escalated small arguments, and stood in his spots doing the background work of keeping a transit station functional. He kept the chip. I know because 5 months later, when I asked him if he still had it, he pulled it out of his vest pocket without hesitation. He'd moved it to his personal effects at some point, taken it off his work vest and put it somewhere he'd keep it, but he'd kept it. She called us strange, I said. "Best compliment I've ever gotten," he said. Part 4, the return. I need to skip forward 14 months. I know that feels like a cheat, skipping 14 months, but here's the thing. Life on Kel 7 was life on Kel 7. It continued. I continued. Darian continued. The station cycled, ships came and went, cargo moved, problems were solved, and then new problems arrived to replace them. And then, 14 months after the day in the concourse, a Vale military courier requested docking clearance for Ring 2. I know because the manifest system flagged it. Vale military vessels were in a separate processing category, and the flag appeared on my console with a reference code I'd seen before. I sat there looking at it for a moment. Then I pinged Darian. He was mid-shift on Ring 4. His response came back in 30 seconds. Saw it, not sure what to think. I sent back, "You remember the chip?" "Obviously." "Then you know exactly what to think." A pause then. "Going to finish my shift." "Sure," I sent back. She didn't come to the concourse this time. She came to the security station. Darian had just finished his end-of-shift log when Priya appeared in the doorway with an expression that I'd later describe as someone who had prepared themselves mentally and was finding the preparation barely adequate. "You have a visitor," Priya said. Darian turned. Cathara filled the doorway. She was in her armor, same as before, the full combat plate with the honor notations. But there were new notations. 3 of them worked into the left shoulder pauldron in the geometric shorthand. New marks since the last time he'd seen her. 3 engagements, then, in 14 months. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Hey," he said. And for the first time, Priya told me this directly, and she was someone who chose her words carefully. Cathara's expression shifted in a way that wasn't calculation, wasn't assessment. She almost smiled. "You say that," she said through the translation layer, "to everything." "Works pretty well," he said. She had a formal request. That was why she'd come back, not just to see him, though I think that was part of it. And if you could find a Vale cultural consultant willing to discuss it, they'd tell you that a silenced commander returning to a place of shield recognition was not a casual thing. But there was a formal component. She was assembling a specialist advisory group. The 3rd Vanguard had been tasked with a navigation mission through the Crescent Drift, surveying the contested shipping routes that had been the original purpose of her solo visit to Kel 7, and they had determined that having a human specialist with transit logistics experience would be operationally useful. Translation: they needed someone who knew cargo routes, manifest systems, and station protocols in this sector. Translation of the translation: she had specifically come back to ask Darian. He had a transit logistics connection through me, which is how my name got included in the request, and how I eventually ended up with a front row seat to the rest of this. But she asked Darian first. She explained the mission. She was precise, organized, thorough. She laid out the operational parameters, the timeline, the risks, the chain of authority. Professional in every way. Priya was still in the doorway. Dia from the second shift team was pretending to work on something on the opposite side of the room. When Cathara finished, Darian was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask something?" he said. "Proceed." "Why me specifically? There are other logistics people on this station. People with more experience than me." She was quiet for one breath, too. "Because," she said, "you are the only being I have encountered in 14 months of travel through 5 systems who moved toward a problem without first calculating whether moving was in their interest." The room was very quiet. "This is a quality," she said, "that I require in close operational proximity." Darian looked at his hands, looked up. "Okay," he said, "yeah, I'll do it." She nodded. In Vale, a nod wasn't a casual gesture. It was a formal acknowledgement, a closing of an agreement. She nodded the way someone signs a document. "Can I bring a colleague?" Darian asked. She looked at him. "Logistics specialist," he said. "Knows the manifests, knows the route data. Very trustworthy. Name? Ren Calloway." He looked over his shoulder at me, because yes, I had followed him there. I was standing just outside the security station door, which I'd been edging toward for the last 20 minutes. I gave a small wave. Cathara looked at me, looked back at Darian. "Agreed," she said. Part 5 ON board. I want to be careful here, because the mission itself involves details that were never fully declassified, and I'm not going to speculate past what I actually know. But what I can tell you about is what it was like. The Vale courier vessel was not large, built for speed and efficiency rather than comfort, which was a Vale design philosophy that carried across all their engineering. It had 24 bunks for the unit, a command section, an operations room, and 3 small auxiliary spaces that got reassigned to Darian and me as our working area. The 24 members of the 3rd Vanguard looked at us the way you'd expect elite warriors to look at 2 civilian logistics specialists from a transit station, with complete and total skepticism about every choice that had led to this moment. All of them except one. There was a young Vale, young by their reckoning, maybe mid-20s in human terms, assigned as our operational liaison. His name translated roughly as Save. He was almost a full meter shorter than Cathara, which still made him taller than me, and he had this quality of watchful curiosity that felt different from the others' skepticism. He watched us the way someone watches a phenomenon they haven't classified yet. On the second day out from Kel 7, he sat across from us in our auxiliary workspace while I was running route analysis, and Darian was reviewing docking protocol variations across the survey region. "You are the one from the concourse," Save said to Darian. "Yeah," Darian said, without looking up from his data slate. "The commander told us about it." Darian did look up then. She did. "In operational context, as an example of," he paused, working for the word, "behavioral unpredictability as tactical asset." Darian and I exchanged a look. "She used me as a training example," Darian said. "A positive example," Save said, which seemed to be important to him. "What did she say?" I asked. Save considered the question with a seriousness that suggested he was choosing how much to translate literally versus how much to approximate. "She said," he said carefully, "that the most dangerous variable in any situation is the being who acts on principle before calculating cost. She said this because most species, most of the time, calculate cost. This is rational. It is also predictable. The human who acted in the concourse did not calculate. An unpredictable principled action is, he paused, very difficult to counter. She said I was unpredictable, Darian said. As a compliment, Save said. Right, Darian said slowly. Highest form of compliment available, I said. He shot me a look. That's what the chip said, I reminded him. The mission took 11 days. I'm not going to walk through all of it. Some of it was genuinely classified. Some of it was just the long, grinding work of transit surveys and route documentation. And some of it was the kind of interpersonal adjustment you go through when you're in a small vessel with 24 elite warriors who weren't sure what to make of you and 2 civilians who weren't sure what to make of any of this. But I want to tell you about Day 7. Day 7 was when things went sideways. The contested routing in the Crescent Drift had contested elements for a reason. There were parties with interest in keeping that region murky, keeping the official survey data incomplete or disputed, which gave them operational flexibility that a clear survey would eliminate. We'd known this going in. The 3rd Vanguard had prepared for potential interference. What they hadn't fully prepared for was the specific form the interference took. At approximately the 4th hour of Day 7, 3 vessels appeared on the approach sensors at a range that was closer than they should have been able to get without detection. They'd used a passive drift approach, no engine signature, using the natural motion of a debris field to mask their trajectory. And they'd timed it against the survey vessel's sensor sweep cycle with a precision that suggested they knew the sweep parameters. They were not Krothe. They were not any species I had reference for. They were flying under a registry code that Save spent 40 seconds trying to resolve before telling us it was a ghost registration. The number existed, but attached to a vessel that had been decommissioned 3 years ago. The 3rd Vanguard went from standard operations to full combat readiness in the kind of time that made me think I'd never actually understood the word fast before. Darian and I were told, clearly and firmly, to stay in the auxiliary workspace and not move. We stayed. We didn't not move. Because at the 6-minute mark of the engagement, which was happening at range, electronic and positional, not physical yet, one of the opposing vessels made a trajectory change that the 3rd Vanguard's tactical system didn't catch fast enough, and it came across on the survey vessel's port side at a range that was technically within weapons distance. The weapons distance that was between the port side and the auxiliary workspace where Darian and I were sitting. I became aware of this because the hull began making a sound. Specifically, the sound of localized electromagnetic interference interacting with the hull plating at a frequency that made your back teeth ache. That's not good, Darian said. No, I agreed. He was already moving. He crossed the auxiliary workspace in 4 steps, pulled open the equipment locker that our liaison Save had shown us on Day 1 as part of the in case of emergency find this briefing, and pulled out 2 emergency environment suits. He handed one to me. Put it on, he said. Darian's. Ren put it on. I put it on. The sound in the hull got worse. Then for about 8 seconds it stopped entirely, which was somehow worse than the sound. Then the comm in the auxiliary workspace, a small unit mounted on the wall that we'd used 3 times in 7 days, crackled. Kethara's voice. Logistics team, report your status. Darian hit the comm. We're suited, we're good, what's happening? A pause, the kind of pause that has a lot happening in it. The situation is being resolved. Stay in position. Your workspace is structurally sound, but we are experiencing localized interference in that sector. The suit precaution was, another pause, correct. Copy, Darian said. A longer pause. You suited each other, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He suited me, I said, because that was accurate. Before or after the hull sound? During, Darian said. The longest pause of all. Stay in position, she said again, and then quieter in what the comm almost didn't catch. We will be done shortly. They were done in 19 minutes. The 3 vessels withdrew. The survey mission continued. The 3rd Vanguard swept the sector, confirmed no remaining threats, and returned to standard operations. Nobody mentioned the 19 minutes at dinner that night. But Save looked at Darien differently from day 8 onward. More like the way the rest of the unit looked at Cathara. With that specific kind of attention that wasn't admiration, exactly. It was too measured for that, but was something in the neighborhood. Recognition, maybe. Part 6, the thing about shields. On the last day of the mission, the evening before we'd be back in range of Kel 7's docking systems, Cathara found me in the auxiliary workspace alone. Darien had gone to the commissary section. The Veil had started including us in meals on about day 4, which Save said was significant, and which I'd been careful not to make a bigger deal of than it was. She stood in the doorway. The armor was off, she wore the base layer, the form-fitting underlayer that the combat plate attached to, and without the visual mass of the armor she looked different. Not smaller, never smaller, but less like a function and more like a person. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She considered, then nodded. "The message on the chip, you said you didn't have a framework for what he did, that you found the absence of one unsatisfying." I paused. "Did you find a framework?" She was quiet for a long time. "I developed a working hypothesis," she said. "Which is?" "That there are 2 categories of being." She paused, organizing it. "Those who calculate proximity, who come close to situations based on what proximity costs and returns. And those who default to proximity, who approach before the calculation because something in their structure makes approach the prior motion. The calculation happens afterward, if at all." I thought about that. "Darien's the second type," I said. "Evidently, it is not common in my observation, not even in humans, but it appears to be a human trait in a way it is not a Veil trait, or a Crothi trait, or any of the 7 other species I have worked beside." "You mean we have more of them?" "Proportionally, anecdotally, my sample is limited," the closest thing she ever did to a dry joke. "But yes." I sat with that for a moment. "Is that why you came back?" I asked. "Operationally it makes sense, but is that actually why?" The longest pause. "Partially," she said. "I didn't push." She turned to leave, and then stopped, and said without looking back. "In Veil, we have a concept. A shield is not only a defensive object. A shield is a declaration. When you raise a shield between yourself and something that threatens another, you are declaring that their existence has value to you that exceeds your immediate calculation of cost. This is a significant declaration." She paused. "Your colleague made that declaration without knowing he was making it. Without knowing who I was, without knowing the cost, without language for what the declaration meant." Another pause. "I have been in 36 engagements. I have had soldiers stand beside me and blades raised for me and lives laid down. All by people who knew me, knew my rank, knew what it cost and what they gained from it." Her voice was quiet. I had not had a stranger shield me. "It is," she said very carefully, "a different weight." She left. I sat in the auxiliary workspace for a long time, listening to the hum of the ship around me and the faint sound of voices from the commissary section. And I didn't do any work at all. Part 7, what came after? We docked at Kel 7 on day 12. The 3rd Vanguard's vessel settled into Ring 2 with the precision of a unit that did nothing carelessly, and the docking process completed, and Darien and I collected our gear and made our way back through the docking corridor and into the station. The station smelled like it always did, that mineral burn undertone, overlaid with the commissary's cycle of whatever was cooking, overlaid with the particular atmosphere of 1,000 beings sharing sealed air. Home, such as it was. Priya was at the security station. She looked at us the way she always looked at people returning from something she'd thought was a questionable decision. "How was it?" she said. "Educational," I said. She looked at Darien. "Yeah," he said, what she said. Cathara was the last off the vessel. She came through the docking corridor in her full armor, the 3rd Vanguard forming up behind her, and she walked to where we were standing, and she stopped. Around us, the station did what stations do. It moved and hummed and processed and carried on. She looked at Darien. He looked at her. "Dock officer," she said formally. "Not on duty right now," he said. "Darien," she said. "That's better," he said. She reached to her left pauldron, the one with the honor notations, and she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She traced one of the markings, not one of the new ones from recent engagements, one that had been there before. An older mark worked into the lower section of the pauldron where the notations clustered most densely. This mark, she said, was made after my first command engagement. It designates the unit I led and the outcome. She paused. I have been considering adding a mark that does not fit existing notation. We have marks for unit bonds, for oaths given, for alliances formed in combat. We do not have a mark for. She stopped, reorganized. I have decided to make a new notation for a category that does not currently exist in our marking system. The category of an act freely given, freely received between strangers, a shield without expectation. She looked at him very directly. I wanted you to know that it will be there, on my armor. If we ever meet again and you see it, you will know what it means. Darian was very quiet. Then he said, "Thank you." Just that, thank you. The way he'd said hey in the concourse, complete in itself, no performance around it. She nodded, the formal veil acknowledgement. She turned. The third vanguard fell in around her, and they walked back toward Ring 2 and their ship, and whatever the galaxy had waiting for them. Priya appeared at Darian's elbow. I heard approximately none of that, she said. What happened? Darian rolled his left shoulder. She said goodbye, he said. Epilogue, what I think about it. I've told this story a few times over the years. Not many. It's not the kind of story you tell casually, and I'm careful about who I tell it to, partly because some of it involves operational information I'm not supposed to discuss, and partly because stories like this have a way of getting simplified in the telling. They become about one thing when they were actually about several things at once. What people usually want it to be about is humans being brave, proof that we're capable of something the rest of the galaxy isn't. Evidence for some innate quality that separates us from the species that calculate first. I think that's true, partially. I think Darian had something that morning in the concourse that not everyone has, not a physical quality, not a trained quality, but something in the wiring, the default proximity thing, the prior motion toward the problem. But I think the story is also about something else. It's about what happens when you're seen. Cathara was the most feared warrior in a sector of space. She had honor marks carved into her armor from 36 engagements. She commanded 24 elite soldiers. She had power and reputation and capability that most beings never approach. And someone had cornered her in a transit concourse and made her feel small. Not physically threatened, she'd assessed that and set it aside, but crowded, isolated, reminded that she was alone and that her status here in this non-veil space didn't protect her from the specific smallness that 6 larger beings can create around one. And Darian walked over. He didn't walk over because he knew who she was. He didn't walk over because of any calculation involving the third vanguard or veil compact relations or the diplomatic geometry of the situation. He walked over because he saw someone having a hard time, and he was there. That's the story, I think. Not human bravery, or not only that. Human proximity. The willingness to step close to something hard because the alternative is standing back and watching it happen, and that alternative doesn't sit right in some of us, doesn't sit right at all. Darian Voss stood in front of the most feared warrior in the sector. Not to protect her from physical harm. To protect her from something smaller and harder and more persistent than physical harm. He didn't know that was what he was doing. She knew exactly what he'd done. And years later, somewhere in the galaxy, there is a Veil Silence commander in combat armor with a new notation on her left pauldron. A mark without precedent in the Veil notation system. A category created for one act, in one concourse, on one unremarkable station floating in an unremarkable stretch of space. A shield freely given. Between strangers. I think about that when the station gets loud and complicated and hard to parse. When the species don't understand each other, and the political geometries get tangled, and the calculation of costs and returns seems to govern everything. I think, somewhere, carved into the armor of one of the most formidable beings any of us has ever encountered, is a mark that started with a man shrugging his left shoulder and saying, "Because it needed doing, and I was there." That's enough, I think. That's exactly enough.